Opening. At 6:12 on a Saturday morning in August of 1997, a sheriff's deputy stood on my porch and told me to keep my hands where he could see them, which would have been funny if my coffee had not been shaking hard enough to make little brown waves in the mug. My husband Evan was still upstairs, half dressed and dripping from the shower, and down at the end of our gravel drive stood Celia Harrow in a pink raincoat, holding a thermos in one hand and smiling like she had just won a raffle. She had called 911 and told dispatch that I was trespassing in our own lake house. I wish I could tell you that was the strangest thing Celia did that summer, but by the time the leaves started turning gold around Birch Bay, a false police report was practically the polite part of the story. My name is Marlene Cole, though everybody around our little town outside Charlevoix called me Marnie, and back then I was 49 years old, worked in the library at Glenwood Middle School, wore sensible shoes, kept peppermints in my purse, and believed the worst thing a homeowners association could do was complain about somebody's weeds. I had no idea a person with a clipboard, a landline telephone, and too much free time could turn a quiet lakeside neighborhood into a full-blown war zone. Evan and I bought the Haskins cottage in late spring, just after our youngest son left for college, and the house we had raised 3 kids and started feeling too big, too quiet, too full of old arguments trapped in the walls. The place sat at the far end of Birch Bay, a weathered cedar cottage with green shutters, a little dock that leaned left after every hard winter, and an old stone path down to the water that had probably been there longer than half the people on the county board. It was not fancy, not even close. The kitchen was the color of old butter, the floorboards complained every time you walked to the bathroom, and the porch screen had 3 patches in it from somebody's unsuccessful battle with a raccoon, but it was ours. Or at least, it was Evan's family trusts, which would become a very important detail later, because Celia Harrow had a remarkable talent for turning ordinary paperwork into a weapon. The cottage had belonged to Evan's uncle Silas, a quiet man who fixed boat motors in his driveway and believed every child deserved a fishing pole, even if their parents did not. When Silas died, he left the place to the Cole Family Land Trust with Evan listed as trustee. I was not named directly on the deed, because back in the 70s Uncle Silas had done things the old-fashioned way, with 1 lawyer, 1 typewriter, and a filing cabinet that smelled like mothballs. It never mattered to us. Evan and I had been married 27 years, paid for the repairs together, paid the taxes together, and planned to grow old there together, sitting by the water and pretending we could still tell the difference between a bass and a bluegill from 30 feet away. We had been at the cottage maybe 40 minutes when Celia came rolling into the drive in a tan Buick that looked like it had spent its entire life parked outside a church luncheon. She got out wearing white tennis shoes, beige slacks, and a sweater tied around her shoulders even though it was nearly 80 degrees, and she carried a leather portfolio tucked under one arm like she was there to negotiate a hostage release. She did not say hello. She did not welcome us to the neighborhood. She walked right past me, past Evan, past the boxes of dishes and the cooler full of hamburger meat, and started circling the cottage, writing things down. Evan gave me that look he had when he was trying very hard not to become the man who said exactly what he was thinking. Finally, he called out, "Can we help you with something?" Celia stopped near the porch steps and looked at us over the top of her glasses. "I am Celia Harrow," she said, "president of the Hearthstone Landing Property Association. We have had some questions about the status of this parcel." I remember thinking, status of this parcel, what kind of person talks like that on a Saturday afternoon? Evan introduced himself, introduced me, told her about Uncle Silas and the trust, and for a second I thought that would be the end of it. Then Celia asked to see the ownership papers. Evan smiled the way he smiled when a stranger asked him whether he had tried turning something off and back on again. "No," he said. "I do not carry my deed around in my pocket." Celia's smile got thinner. She said the association required an occupancy form for any new resident, along with a review of exterior structures, dock access, parking arrangements, and any possible non-family occupants. I looked at Evan. He looked at me. Then he said, "Non-family occupants." Celia turned toward me. "I do not see Mrs. Cole's name in the initial record." There are moments when a person reveals exactly who they are without meaning to, and that was one of them. Not because she asked a question about a deed, but because of the way she looked at me when she asked it, like I was a woman standing in somebody else's house with a suitcase and a bad story. I told her, "I have been married to this man since Jimmy Carter was president, Celia. I think I am allowed to make a sandwich in his kitchen." She did not laugh. Not even a little. Instead, she handed Evan a yellow form with the words "Preliminary Occupancy Concern" typed across the top in a font that looked like it belonged on a funeral home invoice. Then she said, "You have 72 hours to establish compliance." Evan took the paper, folded it once, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "We will establish something," he said. "It just may not be compliance." That was the day Celia decided she did not like us. It took us another month to understand that she had already decided she needed us gone. At first, her little attacks were almost silly. A notice appeared in our mailbox because the shutters were the wrong shade of green, even though they had been green since before Hearthstone Landing existed. Then we got a warning for leaving a canoe beside the shed, even though the association rules allowed boats on private property. Then someone complained that our porch light was too bright, which was funny because it was a single 60-watt bulb that had been hanging there since Uncle Silas was alive. Celia sent letters through the mail, then faxes to Evan's office, then messages through Mr. Rusk, the association treasurer, who was a soft-spoken widower with a comb-over and the permanent look of a man who had just remembered he left the oven on. Mr. Rusk would come by with a folder tucked under his arm and say things like, "Celia asked me to deliver this, but I want you to know I did not vote for it." And Evan would take the papers without opening them, thank him, and wait until he had driven away before tossing them on the kitchen table. I wanted Evan to fight her right away. I wanted him to call a lawyer, call the county, call the governor if he had to. Evan had spent 26 years as a fire investigator for the state, and that kind of work changes a person. He had walked through burned-out homes where everybody was yelling and blaming and crying, and he had learned that the loudest person in the room was often the least useful one. "Let her make mistakes," he kept telling me. "People who need control usually cannot stop themselves once they think they have it." I hated that answer because it sounded patient, and I was fresh out of patience. Then came the morning with the sheriff's deputy. The deputy was a young man named Paul Densmore, maybe 30, with a square jaw, a sunburned neck, and the cautious expression of someone who had been told he was walking into a dangerous situation, but was now staring at a woman in a bathrobe holding a coffee mug. He said dispatch had received a report that an unidentified woman had forced entry into a residence at Hearthstone Landing and refused to leave when confronted by the property association. I told him the unidentified woman was me, that I had been making coffee in my own kitchen, and that the property association could go straight to hell if he wanted my official statement. He tried not to smile. Then Evan came downstairs, buttoning his shirt, and Deputy Densmore looked at him for a long second. "Mr. Cole," he asked. Evan nodded. The deputy stood a little straighter. "You spoke at the academy last fall, fire scene preservation." Evan looked almost embarrassed. "I did." The poor kid looked back toward Celia's Buick and then back at us, and you could see the whole thing rearranging itself in his mind. Evan did not pull rank, did not raise his voice, did not even mention where he worked until the deputy asked. He just brought out the trust papers, our tax records, the electric bill in both our names, and our marriage certificate, which I had to dig out of a metal box behind a stack of Christmas decorations. Deputy Densmore read everything twice, then went outside to speak with Celia. I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. I heard Celia say, "She is not on the deed." I heard the deputy say, "Ma'am, she is his wife." I heard Celia say, "That does not make her legally authorized." Then I heard Evan from behind me, calm as rain on a tin roof, say, "Deputy, I would appreciate it if you would write down exactly what the caller told dispatch, exactly when she said it, and exactly what she knew when she said it." Celia turned around when she heard that. She looked at Evan differently then, not as a man she could inconvenience with rules, but as a man who had just reminded her that paperwork could also move in the other direction. The deputy left after about 20 minutes, apologizing twice. Celia stayed at the edge of our drive for another minute, standing beside her Buick with her thermos and her pink raincoat, and she gave me a look I will never forget. It was not anger exactly. Anger is hot. This was colder than that. It was the look of a person who had been embarrassed in public and had already started planning how to make somebody else pay for it. That night, after we ate cold chicken on the porch because neither one of us felt like cooking, Evan said, "She is not fighting about the deed." I asked what he meant. He pointed down toward the lake, where the water was going gray under the evening sky. "She wants something tied to this property." People do not push this hard over a form. I told him he was being dramatic. He smiled a little. "Marnie, I investigate fires. I am allowed one dramatic thought a year." I laughed, but I did not sleep much that night. Part 2, the middle. The next 2 weeks made the 911 call seem almost quaint. Celia reported our cottage to the insurance company for having an unsafe wood stove, even though the stove had been inspected the previous fall. She called the township about our septic system, even though we had not spent enough time in the house to clog a sink. She sent a letter to the school superintendent suggesting that I was using school resources to support a private real estate venture, which was so absurd I nearly laughed, until I realized somebody had taken the time to type it on association letterhead. That was the part that got to me, not because I was afraid I would lose my job, but because I had spent 23 years building a life where people knew me as dependable. I was the lady who stayed late to help a kid find a book about volcanoes, the lady who kept spare mittens in the lost and found, the lady who knew which teachers needed coffee before 8 in the morning. And suddenly, because one woman wanted control over a cottage by the water, I was being turned into a rumor. One evening I came home from school and found Evan sitting at the kitchen table with 3 county maps spread out in front of him, along with Uncle Silas's old trust papers and a flashlight even though it was still daylight. He looked tired in a way I knew well. Evan was never tired because of work. He was tired when something bothered him personally. "What did you find?" I asked. He tapped a faded survey map with his finger. "The association never had authority over this parcel." I sat down across from him. "What do you mean, never had authority?" He explained that Hearthstone Landing had been built in stages. The original cottages along Birch Bay had existed before the developer carved up the hill behind us into neat little lots with matching mailboxes and rules about lawn furniture. Uncle Silas's cottage, along with 4 others near the shore, had been excluded from the association charter. The association could ask us to join. It could not order us to join. It could not fine us. It could not regulate our dock, our porch, our canoe, or whether I made coffee in my own kitchen. "Then why is Celia acting like she owns the place?" I asked. Evan did not answer right away. He pulled another paper from the stack, a proposal from 2 years earlier for a new marina and boat launch on the eastern side of the bay. The plan had been rejected because the old cottages held a shared easement over the access road and the shoreline path. If the association got control of our cottage, or persuaded us to sign away those rights, the developer could reopen the deal. "Celia's brother runs Bixby Development," Evan said quietly, "and she sits on the association board that would approve the sale." I remember looking out the window toward the lake and feeling something settle in my stomach. Until then, Celia had been an annoyance, a bully with a filing cabinet. But suddenly there was a reason behind every letter, every false complaint, every little attempt to make our lives uncomfortable. She did not want us to obey. She wanted us to get tired, scared, and willing to sign whatever she put in front of us. The first time she actually asked, it happened in the most insulting way possible. She came by on a Wednesday afternoon while I was watering the flowers, parked her Buick halfway across the drive, and handed me a manila envelope. Inside was an offer from Bixby Development to purchase the cottage for far less than it was worth. There was a note clipped to the front that said, "This would resolve all outstanding concerns." I stood there with the hose in one hand and that offer in the other, and I said, "Celia, did you honestly think I would see a lowball offer from your brother and call it peace?" She smiled as if I had said something adorable. "You and Evan are not young, Marnie. This is a lot of property to maintain. Sometimes people are happier when they stop resisting reality." I shut off the hose. Sometimes people are happier when they stop pretending greed is a community service. That was when her face changed. She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell that sharp floral perfume she wore, and she said, "You should be careful about how you speak to people who can make things difficult." I looked down at the papers in my hand, then back at her. "Celia, you already called the police on me for making coffee. I think we are past difficult." She left without another word. That night Evan borrowed a small black and white security camera from his friend Lenny, who used it to watch his bait shop after someone stole a freezer full of night crawlers. The camera fed into an old VCR in the bedroom, and the picture was grainy enough to make everybody look guilty, but it covered the front door, the porch, and most of the driveway. I thought it was overkill. Then, 3 nights later, we came back from dinner in town and found our front door unlocked. Nothing had been taken. That was the first thing that made it worse. If somebody steals your television, you get mad. If somebody walks through your home, opens drawers, turns your wedding photograph face down and leaves without taking anything, you feel something else. You feel watched. The drawer where Evan kept his old service sidearm was open. The desk where I kept school paperwork had been searched. A framed picture of our boys was sitting face down on the couch. I stood in the living room with my purse still over my shoulder and felt the whole cottage change around me. It was no longer a place we were fixing up. It was a place someone had entered to remind us they could. Evan checked the tape. The camera had caught a figure coming up the steps around 8:30 that evening. The image was fuzzy, but you could see a woman in a light-colored raincoat holding something in one hand. She used a key. She came in. She came out 11 minutes later. When Evan paused the tape, I could see the shape of Celia's face just long enough to know it was her. I wanted to call the sheriff immediately. Evan did call, but first he made copies of the tape. Then he called the county clerk. Then he called a colleague of his named Wade Benson, a state investigator who had spent most of his career making sure people did not tamper with evidence after suspicious fires. "I do not want a favor," Evan told him. "I want to know what I need to preserve before this turns into everybody's word against everybody else's." Wade came out the next morning in a windbreaker and brown boots, carrying a camera bag and a notebook. He watched the tape once without speaking. Then he watched it again. He asked if the association had emergency keys. Evan said yes, supposedly for fire or medical access only, locked in a metal box at the clubhouse. Wade asked who had access to the box. We both said Celia. He nodded, wrote something down, and said, "This is not an association dispute anymore." The trouble with a person like Celia is that they do not see a warning as a warning. They see it as a challenge. 2 days after Wade came by, Celia showed up at our front door with a lawyer named Dale Kincaid, a skinny man in a gray suit who looked like he had been hired directly from a bad daytime television show. He carried a leather briefcase and kept wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, even though it was barely 70 degrees. Celia stood behind him with her arms folded, looking pleased as a cat beside a tipped-over fish bowl. Dale handed Evan a document and said the association was issuing a formal cease and desist order regarding our unauthorized occupancy, non-compliant structures, and harassment of association leadership. Evan took the paper, read the first paragraph, then asked, "Dale, did you read the 1974 charter before you put your name on this?" Dale blinked. "I was informed that your property is subject to the association." Evan handed him a photocopy of the survey map. "No, you were told that by a woman who needs this property for a development deal." Celia's jaw tightened. Dale looked down at the map, then at the notice, then back at Evan. "I would need to review this," he said. Celia snapped. "You do not need to review anything. They are intimidating the board." Evan stepped closer, not threatening, not loud, just calm in that way that always made me more nervous than yelling. "Celia," he said, "you called the police under false pretenses. You filed reports with agencies you knew had no basis. You entered our house using an emergency key, and you are trying to force a sale for a project your brother stands to profit from. This is not intimidation. This is the part where you stop. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You think your little government job scares me? Evan looked at her for a moment. No, I think the truth scares you. That is different. Dale folded the notice and put it back in his briefcase. Celia stared at him like he had betrayed her. He said, Mrs. Harrow, I believe we should postpone further action until I have reviewed the documents. She turned on her heel and walked back to the Buick, and Dale followed behind her, still holding the handkerchief. I watched them drive away, and for a moment I felt relief. Then I saw the look on Evan's face. She is going to get worse, he said. He was right. The following week, anonymous letters started appearing in mailboxes around Hearthstone Landing. Some said Evan had threatened association members. Some said I was being investigated by the school district. One said our cottage was unsafe and should be condemned before it caught fire. That one made Evan go quiet. I asked if it bothered him. He said, no, it tells me she is running out of facts. But I could see it bothered him. He had spent his life trying to keep people safe from fires, and now someone was using that work to make him look dangerous. The thing that finally cracked the whole story open did not come from us. It came from a woman named Tessa Moore, who lived 2 cottages down from the old Haskins place. Tessa was 71, widowed, sharp as a tack, and had the kind of voice that made every sentence sound like she had already made up her mind about you. She came over one afternoon carrying a casserole dish with aluminum foil on top, which is how women of a certain age announce that something serious is about to be discussed. She sat at our kitchen table, pushed the casserole toward me, and said, Celia tried to do this to my husband before he died. Tessa pulled out a stack of old letters. Celia had cited their cottage for violations that did not exist, threatened liens, pressured them to sell to Bixby Development, and even sent a letter suggesting Tessa's husband was not mentally fit to make decisions. Tessa had kept every paper. Then Mr. Rusk came by after dark, pale and sweating, and told us he had found something in the association books. Celia had been charging selected residents special enforcement fees, then moving money through a maintenance account that paid Bixby Development for work that never happened. He had been too scared to say anything because Celia knew about a tax mistake he had made after his wife died, and she had used it to keep him quiet. That was the moment I understood the real story was bigger than our cottage. Celia had not become cruel because we arrived. We had just stepped on a loose floorboard in a house that had been rotten for years. Evan spread Tessa's letters, Mr. Rusk's records, the tape of Celia entering our home, and the false complaint log across our dining room table. I looked at all of it and felt that old urge to run. I told Evan maybe we should sell anyway, not to Celia, not to Bixby, just sell to someone and get out of there. He looked at me for a long time before he answered. You know what happens when a fire starts in one apartment and nobody calls it in because they think it is not their problem. I nodded. It spreads, he said. This is the same thing. She has been doing this to people who thought they were alone. I hated that he was right. I hated that it meant we had to stay. But I also knew that if we left, Tessa would still be there, Mr. Rusk would still be scared, and Celia would just find somebody else who was easier to push around. So we stayed. Part 3, the ending. The special meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night at the Volunteer Fire Hall, and by 7 o'clock every folding chair in that building was full. People stood along the walls, sat on window ledges, leaned in the doorway with rain dripping from their jackets. The air smelled like wet wool, burnt coffee, and those powdered donuts somebody always brings to community meetings because apparently sugar helps people argue. Celia sat at the front table beneath a crooked American flag, wearing a navy blue blazer and a pearl necklace, with Dale Kincaid 2 seats away from her looking like he would rather be anywhere else, including prison. Evan and I sat near the back with Tessa, Mr. Rusk, Wade Benson, and 2 county investigators, who had arrived quietly 10 minutes earlier and taken seats near the door. Celia opened the meeting by tapping a pencil against the table and saying, "We are here tonight to address a coordinated attempt to undermine community standards by a small group of residents." I remember looking around the room at all those faces, people who had known each other for years, people who had borrowed ladders and watched each other's children and helped shovel driveways after bad storms. And I thought how strange it was that fear could make neighbors sit silently, while one person rewrote reality in front of them. Celia went on for nearly 10 minutes. She said Evan had abused his professional connections. She said I had spread lies. She said the association was being unfairly attacked for trying to maintain safety and property values. Then she held up a copy of the 911 report and said, "This family has created disruption from the day they arrived." That was when Evan stood up. He did not rush. He did not slam his hand on the table. He just carried an old 27-inch television across the floor with Wade's help, set it on a rolling cart, and pushed a VHS tape into the VCR beneath it. The screen came alive with gray lines and snow, then the image cleared. There was our front porch. There was Celia in her light raincoat. There was the key in her hand. There was the moment she looked over her shoulder before stepping into our home. Nobody said a word. You could hear the rain hitting the metal roof. Evan let the tape play until she came back out, then paused it. Celia stood so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "That tape proves nothing," she said. "I was conducting an emergency inspection." Evan looked at her. "What emergency?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Tessa stood next. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was not. She told the room about the letters Celia had sent when her husband was sick, the threats, the false fees, the offer from Bixby Development that arrived 2 weeks after her husband died. Then Mr. Rusk stood, holding a manila folder against his chest. He said he had made mistakes and he had been afraid, but he was done being afraid. He laid out the financial records, the maintenance payments, the names of properties marked for acquisition, the unexplained fees. One of the county investigators walked to the front and asked Celia if she would like to explain why association money had been paid to Bixby Development for repairs that never occurred. Celia's face went white, then red, then white again. She pointed at Evan and said, "This is a setup. He has friends in government." Evan shook his head. "No, Celia, you had friends in silence. That is not the same thing." That was the line people remembered later, but the moment I remember came after. Celia looked at me, not Evan, me. She said, "You are enjoying this, aren't you? You people came here and turned everyone against me." For a second I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her how it felt to wake up to a deputy at my door, how it felt to have coworkers whispering because somebody had mailed lies about me, how it felt to walk into my own living room and find my family photo face down. But I did not say any of that. I stood up, smoothed my skirt and said, "No, Celia. I am not enjoying it. I am tired. Tessa is tired. Mr. Rusk is tired. Every person you made feel small so you could feel important is tired. That is what you never understood. You did not build a community. You built a room full of people who were afraid to speak." It got quiet then, the real kind of quiet, the kind that makes you hear your own breath. Celia looked around the room, and for the first time, nobody looked away. The association board voted that night to suspend her immediately. Dale Kincaid resigned before the vote was even finished. The county investigators took the financial documents, the master key records, and the tapes. Within a month, Celia was charged with filing false reports, unlawful entry, fraud related to association funds, and attempting to coerce property sales under false claims of authority. Her brother's marina deal disappeared with her. The state ordered a full review of Hearthstone Landing's charter, and the association had to repay several residents for fees they never should have been charged in the first place. Tessa got a check that she said she was going to use for a trip to see her granddaughter in Arizona. Mr. Rusk sold his Buick, bought a fishing boat that was much too expensive for a man his age, and told everybody he was done keeping books for people who treated numbers like weapons. Evan and I helped draft the new association rules, though we made sure the first line was simple enough that nobody could twist it later. No board member could inspect a private home alone. No emergency key could be used without a sheriff, firefighter, or written consent. Every complaint had to be signed, dated, and reviewed by more than one person. No secret fines. No private deals. No favors for developers. We did not become the heroes of Birch Bay, at least not in the way movies make heroes. We still had leaky gutters. We still argued about whether the dock needed replacing. I still got annoyed when Evan left his boots by the back door. But something changed after that summer. People started knocking on each other's doors again without carrying forms. The association held meetings where people talked about snow removal and potholes instead of spying and fines. The old Haskins cottage stayed hours, crooked dock and all. Then about 8 months after the meeting at the fire hall, I got a plain white envelope in the mail. No return address, no stamp, just our names written in blue ink. Inside was a photocopy of Celia's sentencing agreement. She had taken a plea deal, avoided jail, paid restitution, and was barred from serving on any homeowners association board in the state for 10 years. There was no note, no threat, nothing else. Just the legal paper. I stood in the kitchen holding it while Evan made coffee. He asked, "How do you feel?" I thought about it for a while. I expected to feel victorious. I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt sad in a way I had not expected, not sad for Celia exactly because she had made her choices, but sad for how much damage one person could do when everybody else decided staying quiet was easier. I put the paper in a drawer and said, "I feel like we got lucky." Evan nodded. "That is not luck," he said. "That is people finally speaking." Maybe he was right. Maybe not. There is still a part of me that wonders about Celia. I heard through somebody at the county courthouse that she moved south after the case was over. I heard she blamed Evan, blamed the investigators, blamed the association, blamed every person in the room except herself. But I also heard she had written letters to a few people, including Tessa, apologizing for things she had done. Tessa never answered. I do not know whether that makes Tessa cold or wise. I do not know whether Celia deserved forgiveness, or whether some people only apologize when they finally run out of power. I do know this, though. A community does not become cruel overnight. It happens in tiny pieces, one false complaint, one quiet threat, one neighbor deciding not to get involved because it is easier to look away. And it gets better the same way, one person speaking up, one record kept, one frightened neighbor realizing they are not alone. So tell me what you think. Did we do the right thing by taking Celia all the way down, or should we have found a way to stop her without letting the whole town see how deep the rot went? Was that justice, or was it revenge dressed up in better clothes? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I have learned that the most dangerous people in a community are not always the loud ones. Sometimes they are the ones who make everybody else afraid to speak.